Hi, welcome to the Silent Avenger channel. If you're enjoying the content, please consider giving it a like and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Let's dive into today's story. My name's Winston. I'm 39, an engineer by trade, and until recently, I thought I had my life all figured out. A loving wife, a career I was proud of, and even some recognition for the work I've poured my soul into. Turns out, I was living in a house of cards. The first crack in my perfect life came 2 months ago, when I noticed Elsie, my wife of 10 years, acting different. At first, it was subtle. A bit more guarded with her phone, suddenly working late hours when her office was downsizing, and those random girls' nights that seemed oddly spontaneous. I chalked it up to stress. After all, everyone has rough patches, right? Then one evening, I came home early from a client meeting. The house was too quiet. Usually, Elsie would have her true crime podcasts blaring or be fussing over her garden. But this time, it was just silence. I walked into our home office, my sanctuary, and found something that would make my heart drop. A folder on the desk, left open as if mocking me. Inside were drafts of emails between Elsie and my younger brother, Kirk. At first, it was harmless enough, banter, inside jokes about childhood memories. But then, the tone shifted. They were texting like teenagers. And it was clear this wasn't just emotional cheating. There were plans, intimate confessions, and references to meetings I didn't know about. One phrase stuck with me: "I'll handle Winston when the time comes." What the hell did that mean? I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I spent the night in our guest room, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece it all together. Was I being paranoid? Maybe there was a logical explanation. Deep down, though, I already knew the truth. Kirk always had a knack for taking what wasn't his, but I never imagined he'd stoop this low. I took a week to gather evidence. I dug into her phone records, her emails, and even her calendar. Each discovery felt like another knife to the chest. They weren't just sneaking around, they were plotting against me. And then it hit me: this wasn't just about the affair. Kirk had been sniffing around my work for months, showing an unusual interest in my latest project, a groundbreaking piece of tech I'd been developing for years. He knew it could revolutionize the industry, and now it seemed he wanted to claim it as his own. The betrayal was too much. It wasn't just my wife and my brother, it was my entire life being turned upside down. I decided to play it smart. I wasn't going to lose everything I worked for to these two. This is where my story begins. And trust me, it gets crazier from here. Stay tuned. The next few days were some of the hardest of my life. I couldn't look at Elsie without imagining her with Kirk. Every kiss she gave me felt like a dagger, every "I love you" sounded hollow. But I knew I couldn't let my emotions take over, not yet. I needed a plan, and for that, I had to keep playing dumb. First, I focused on securing my work. The project I'd been developing was something I called the Novatech, a revolutionary data storage system that was faster, more secure, and cheaper than anything currently on the market. It had the potential to disrupt the entire industry, and if Kirk got his hands on it, he'd ruin everything. I spent a weekend transferring all my files to an encrypted server and removing anything sensitive from my office. I also installed a keylogger on Elsie's laptop to monitor her activity. I knew it was invasive, but at this point, trust was out the window. The first major blow came a few days later when I found emails between Elsie and Kirk discussing the Novatech. She had been feeding him information. Nothing too detailed, but enough for him to make his own moves. I felt sick. My wife wasn't just cheating on me, she was actively sabotaging my career. The next move was to test how far they'd go. I accidentally left a decoy folder on my laptop labeled Novatech Expansion Plans. It was bogus, filled with gibberish and fake schematics. Then, I left the laptop unattended and waited. Sure enough, the keylogger showed that Elsie forwarded the folder to Kirk within hours. That night, I confronted her, not about the affair, but about my work. I told her I'd noticed some inconsistencies in my files and asked if she'd seen anything unusual. Her face went pale, but she quickly covered it up with a smile. "You're always so paranoid, Winston," she said, brushing it off like it was nothing. I felt like I was losing my mind. How could she lie so easily? How could she sleep next to me every night knowing what she was doing? But then, a glimmer of hope: Miranda. Miranda was an investor I'd been working with on Novatech. She was sharp, no nonsense, and one of the few people I trusted completely. We'd always had a professional relationship, but over the years, I'd grown to admire her honesty and dedication. When I told her about my suspicions, she didn't hesitate to offer her help. "I'm not just investing in your project, Winston," she said during one of our meetings. "I'm investing in you. Let's make sure no one takes that away." With her support, I started building a safety net. I began quietly shifting resources into a new company, Novatech. It was risky and required a lot of late nights, but it was worth it. If Kirk thought he could steal Novadrive, he was in for a rude awakening. Meanwhile, Elsie started acting strangely. She was more distant, more irritable. I could tell she knew something was off, but she didn't confront me about it. Instead, she started spending more nights working late. I didn't even ask anymore. I knew exactly where she was going. The breaking point came when I found a hotel receipt in her purse. A suite booked under Kirk's name. That night, I stared at the receipt for hours. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to throw it in her face and demand an explanation. But another part of me, the logical part, knew this wasn't the time. If I wanted to win, I had to be patient. I had to let them think they were getting away with it. And so, I put the receipt back in her purse, smiled when she got home, and acted like everything was fine. They had no idea what was coming. I decided it was time to take things up a notch. If Elsie and Kirk thought they could outsmart me, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. My focus shifted to gathering irrefutable evidence, not just for my peace of mind, but to make sure I had the upper hand when the inevitable fallout came. First, I hired a private investigator. I'll call him Greg. He was an older guy, gruff but experienced, and came highly recommended. When I explained my situation, he didn't flinch. "You'd be surprised how common this is," he said, giving me a knowing look. Within a week, Greg had photos, timestamps, and even audio recordings of Elsie and Kirk meeting at hotels, restaurants, and this one killed me, my parents' house. My parents' house. The place where we celebrated birthdays, holidays, and milestones. The audacity of it made my blood boil. The evidence confirmed what I already knew: this wasn't a fling. It was a full-blown affair, complete with whispered promises and plans for the future. But Greg uncovered something even more damning: documents. Kirk had filed a provisional patent for a data storage system strikingly similar to Novadrive. He was using Elsie's leaks to replicate my work and pass it off as his own. It was like a double punch to the gut. Betrayed by my wife and brother wasn't bad enough. They were also trying to destroy my career. I called Miranda and showed her everything Greg had gathered. She was furious on my behalf, pacing around her office as she reviewed the files. "This isn't just theft, Winston. This is war," she said. "We're going to fight back, and we're going to win." Together, we developed a two-part strategy. First, we would legally secure Novadrive. Miranda's legal team filed for patents on every aspect of the technology, ensuring Kirk couldn't claim it as his own. Then, we prepared for the launch of Novatech, which would make it impossible for Kirk to compete. While this was happening, I kept up appearances at home. Elsie had no idea I knew, and I intended to keep it that way until the time was right. It wasn't easy. Every time she smiled at me, every time she touched my arm or kissed me goodnight, I felt a surge of anger. But I channeled that energy into my work, knowing it would all pay off soon. Then came the moment that changed everything. One evening, while Elsie was working late, Greg called me. "You're going to want to see this," he said. He sent me a video. It was grainy but clear enough. Kirk and Elsie were in a cafe, huddled over a laptop. My laptop. I recognized the stickers on the lid. Somehow, she'd taken it out of the house without me noticing. They were laughing, typing, clearly feeling untouchable. I could feel my chest tightening as I watched, but I didn't stop. At the end of the video, Kirk leaned over and kissed her. She didn't hesitate. That was it. I was done pretending. The next morning, I called my lawyer and set the wheels in motion for divorce proceedings. I also filed a restraining order against Kirk, citing intellectual property theft. He wouldn't see it coming, but I didn't care. Elsie came home that evening, oblivious to what was about to happen. I sat her down in the living room, her favorite spot in the house, and handed her the divorce papers. "Winston, what is this?" she stammered, her voice shaking. "It's over," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I know everything, Elsie. The affair. The lies. The stolen files. I know it all." Her face went pale. Winston, it's not what you think. I can explain. I cut her off. Save it. I don't want an explanation. I want you out of my house and out of my life. For the first time, Elsie was speechless. But I didn't wait for her to respond. I got up, walked to the door, and opened it. You have until tomorrow to pack your things. After that, I'm changing the locks. It was over. And for the first time in months, I felt free. The day after I handed Elsie the divorce papers, she packed her things and left. She tried to plead with me again, tears in her eyes, but I wasn't having it. Save the tears for someone who believes them, I told her. It was cold, but I didn't care. My trust had been shattered, and there was no coming back from that. While Elsie's departure felt like a victory, I knew the real battle was just beginning. Kirk still hadn't made his move, but with the evidence I had against him, it was only a matter of time. Sure enough, 2 days later, I received an email from his lawyer. He was suing me for breach of contract and claiming ownership of the Novatech prototype. It was laughable. Kirk had never been involved in my work, not even peripherally. But I knew this wasn't about legal grounds. It was about creating enough noise to make me look bad. I forwarded the email to Miranda, and she sprang into action. Her team filed a countersuit, citing theft of intellectual property, fraud, and breach of confidentiality agreements. The evidence Greg had gathered was airtight: emails, video footage, patent filings. Kirk didn't have a leg to stand on. But the legal battle wasn't the only storm brewing. News of Kirk's behavior started to spread. It turned out he'd been bragging to some of his so-called friends about his genius new invention. When they found out he was being sued and that the invention wasn't even his, they dropped him like a hot potato. Then came the scandals. Someone leaked photos of Kirk and Elsie together at one of their hotel rendezvous. I swear it wasn't me, probably one of Greg's contacts or a disgruntled hotel employee, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. My parents, who had always been blind to Kirk's faults, were devastated. My mother called me in tears, begging me to make amends. I can't, Mom, I said, my voice firm. This isn't just about the affair. He tried to ruin me. He's not family anymore. She didn't argue. I think she knew deep down that Kirk had crossed a line no one could come back from. Kirk, on the other hand, wasn't taking the fallout well. He called me late one night, drunk and angry, slurring insults and threats. You think you're better than me, huh? He spat. You're nothing without your precious inventions. You've always been a loser. I let him rant for a while, then hung up. I didn't need to argue with him. His life was falling apart, and he knew it. A week later, I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Kirk had been fired from his job. Apparently, his employer didn't take kindly to the bad press surrounding the lawsuit and the affair. With no income and no friends to lean on, he moved into a dingy apartment on the other side of town. As much as I hated him, I couldn't help feeling a twinge of pity. Kirk had always been self-destructive, but this time, he'd outdone himself. Still, I couldn't dwell on his misfortune. I had my own life to rebuild. With Elsie and Kirk out of my life, I could finally focus on what mattered: building Novatech from the ground up. The timing couldn't have been better. The lawsuit Kirk had filed against me was quickly dismissed, thanks to Miranda's legal team and the overwhelming evidence we had. But the publicity surrounding the case inadvertently brought attention to Novatech, and not in a bad way. Miranda called me after the lawsuit was thrown out. Winston, we need to move fast, she said. This is our moment. People are curious about Novatech, and we need to capitalize on it. She was right. While Kirk's name was being dragged through the mud, Novatech was being discussed in tech forums and business columns. Reporters were calling it the next big thing, even though we hadn't officially launched. It was a rare stroke of luck in an otherwise messy situation. We officially launched Novatech 2 months later. Miranda pulled some strings to set up a massive press event. I stood on stage, surrounded by prototypes of Novatech, and explained how it would revolutionize data storage. The crowd loved it. Investors lined up to fund the project, and within weeks, we had more capital than I ever dreamed of. Watching Novatech take off was like watching a dream come to life. Orders for Novatech poured in, partnerships with major tech firms were secured, and we even made headlines in tech magazines. My face was plastered across articles with headlines like, "Engineer rises above betrayal to launch tech empire." For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. But the personal cost of getting here wasn't lost on me. Every milestone, every bit of success, was a reminder of the people who tried to take it all away. Kirk, meanwhile, wasn't handling my success well. One of my friends, who still had ties to him, told me that Kirk had started spiraling. Between losing his job, the scandal with Elsie, and being blacklisted by many in the tech community, he was broke and bitter. Apparently, he tried to pitch his own version of Novatech to a small-time investor, but the guy laughed him out of the room. "You're the guy who tried to steal his brother's work, right?" the investor reportedly said before showing him the door. As for Elsie, she disappeared for a while after the divorce. I'd heard rumors that she and Kirk had a falling out, but I didn't bother digging for details. My focus was on moving forward. Still, it was hard not to feel a grim sense of satisfaction, knowing they were both paying the price for their actions. One evening, about 6 months after Novatech's launch, Miranda invited me to dinner to celebrate our success. We clinked glasses of wine, toasting to the company's meteoric rise. "You know," she said, setting her glass down, "you're handling all this better than most people would. Betrayal like that, it can destroy someone." "I won't lie," I replied. "It almost did. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that you can't let other people's actions define you." Miranda smiled. "Well, here's to moving forward. You deserve it." As the night went on, the conversation shifted from business to more personal topics. It was the first time in years I felt a genuine connection with someone who wasn't tied to the mess of my past. It wasn't a date, not yet, but it felt like the beginning of something new. Something real. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. Life after betrayal is complicated. Even with Novatech thriving and Kirk's schemes falling apart, there are moments when the weight of everything caught up with me. It's not like you can just flip a switch and erase years of love, trust, and shared dreams, no matter how much damage those dreams caused. I threw myself into work, but even that wasn't enough to completely distract me. There were times I'd catch myself staring at the empty side of the bed or glancing at the seat Elsie used to occupy during our weekly dinner nights. It wasn't that I missed her exactly, it was more about mourning the life I thought we had. My therapist, yes, I finally caved and started seeing one, said it was normal. "You're grieving, Winston. Not just your marriage, but the person you thought Elsie was." It made sense, but it didn't make it easier. Meanwhile, the fallout for Kirk and Elsie continued to unfold in ways I couldn't have anticipated. About 3 weeks after Novatech's launch, I got an unexpected call from my mother. "Winston," she began, her voice shaky, "can we talk?" I sighed. I knew this was coming. My mother had been struggling to reconcile her love for Kirk with the mess he'd created. It didn't help that she still clung to the hope that our family could somehow heal. "I don't know what there is to talk about, Mom," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Kirk made his choices." "I know," she replied quickly. "And I'm not defending him. But he's not doing well, Winston. He's lost everything. I don't know how to help him." I closed my eyes, frustration bubbling up. "Mom, he didn't just hurt me. He tried to ruin my life. He brought this on himself." There was a long pause. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I think he's sorry." That caught me off guard. "Kirk? Sorry?" It didn't seem possible. "What makes you think that?" I asked cautiously. "He called me last night. He was crying, Winston. He said he wished he could undo everything. That he ruined his own life trying to destroy yours." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to believe her, to think that Kirk was finally facing the consequences of his actions. But another part of me, the part still nursing fresh wounds, couldn't trust a word of it. "I'll think about it," I said eventually, more to end the conversation than anything else. The call stayed with me for days. I wasn't ready to forgive Kirk, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't beyond redemption. It wasn't about letting him back into my life, it was about finding closure for myself. One night, as I was mulling it over, Miranda texted me out of the blue. "Miranda, hey, want to grab a drink? I feel like we could both use a break from work." I hesitated for a moment before replying. "Me, sure. Your pick." An hour later, we were sitting in a cozy little bar downtown. The atmosphere was warm, the conversation easy. Miranda had a way of making me forget about all the chaos, even if just for a little while. "So," she said, swirling her glass of whiskey, "how's the whole family drama situation?" I laughed bitterly. "Complicated. My mom thinks Kirk is sorry. I'm not convinced." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. You don't have to forgive him, you know. Forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook. It's about freeing yourself from their hold on you. Her words hit me harder than I expected. For months, I'd been carrying the weight of Kirk's betrayal, letting it fester in the background of my life. Maybe it was time to let some of that go, not for his sake, but for mine. Thanks, I said, raising my glass. To moving forward. To moving forward, she echoed with a smile. The day after my conversation with Miranda, I woke up feeling lighter, like a small part of the weight I'd been carrying had finally lifted. But life has a funny way of pulling you back in just when you think you've found some clarity. I was in the middle of a strategy meeting at Novatech when my phone buzzed. I ignored it at first, but then it buzzed again. And again. Finally, I glanced at the screen and saw a string of missed calls from my dad. That wasn't normal. I excused myself and called him back. His voice was tense. "Winston, your brother's in trouble." I groaned inwardly. "What now?" "He's been arrested." That got my attention. "Arrested? For what?" "Breaking and entering," Dad said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "At your old office." I had to sit down. "You're kidding me." "I wish I was," Dad replied. He said he was just trying to get what's rightfully his. "Winston, what's going on between you two?" "He's never been like this before." I almost laughed at that. Kirk had always been like this, entitled, reckless, and willing to cross any line to get what he wanted. But this? Breaking into my old office to steal, what? Scraps of my work? It was a new low, even for him. I explained the situation to my dad in broad strokes. How Kirk had tried to steal my project, how Elsie had been involved, how I'd moved on and built Novatech. By the time I finished, he was silent. "Dad," I said finally, "I don't know how to help him. And honestly, I don't know if I want to." Kirk's arrest made the local news, which only added to his growing list of public humiliations. I didn't bother reaching out to him. There was nothing left to say. But it was clear he was spiraling, and I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that his actions weren't just about me, they were about his own self-destruction. The fallout from his arrest was swift. My parents were devastated, though my mom tried to downplay it. "He's just lost right now," she said during one of our strained phone calls. "He needs help, Winston. He needs to take responsibility," I shot back. "And I'm not going to be the one to bail him out this time." That night, I got a call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was Kirk. "Winston," he began, his voice shaky. "I need to talk to you." I sighed. "What could you possibly have to say to me, Kirk?" There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I'm sorry. For everything. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I don't know what else to do." His words caught me off guard. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Was this genuine remorse? Or was it just another manipulation? I didn't trust him enough to find out. "You're right," I said finally. "You don't deserve my forgiveness. But I hope, for your sake, you figure your life out. Goodbye, Kirk." I hung up before he could say anything else. The next few days were a whirlwind. Between running Novatech and dealing with the fallout from Kirk's arrest, I barely had time to process everything. But one thing was clear, I was done letting him take up space in my life. Miranda noticed my tension during one of our meetings. "You okay?" she asked, handing me a coffee. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just dealing with family stuff." She raised an eyebrow. "Need to talk about it?" I shook my head. "Not this time. But thanks." She gave me a reassuring smile. "Just remember, you've got people in your corner." Her words stayed with me long after she left. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone. And that, more than anything, gave me the strength to keep moving forward. After Kirk's arrest, I realized I needed to make a definitive break, not just from him but from the toxic legacy of my family dynamic. For years, I had been tethered to the idea of fixing things, of being the bigger person, of hoping that one day, everything would magically resolve itself. But the truth? Some things are beyond repair. The weekend after Kirk's arrest, my parents called for a family meeting. My gut told me it wasn't going to be productive, but out of respect for them, I agreed to go. I told myself it would be the last time I let them drag me into Kirk's mess. We met at my parents' house, the same place where so many childhood memories, both good and bad, were forged. The atmosphere was tense the moment I walked in. My mom looked like she'd been crying, and my dad's expression was unreadable. Kirk wasn't there, thank God. Winston, my mom began, her voice shaky, we need to talk about what's happened. About Kirk. I sat down, crossing my arms. What is there to talk about? He broke the law. He has to face the consequences. That's not fair, she shot back, tears welling up. He's your brother. He made a mistake, but he's family. Family forgives. Forgiveness isn't a free pass, I said, my tone sharper than I intended. You keep enabling him, and look where it's gotten him. He's nearly 40, Mom, and still thinks he can get away with anything because you'll clean up his mess. My dad cleared his throat. Winston's got a point, Margaret. Maybe it's time we stop bailing Kirk out. My mom glared at him, then turned back to me. You've always been so hard on him. Maybe if you'd been more supportive. Supportive. I interrupted, laughing bitterly. I've spent my entire life being his punching bag. I gave him chances, Mom. I even let him into my professional world, and he tried to destroy me. How much more support do you think he deserves? She opened her mouth to respond but closed it again, seemingly at a loss for words. My dad sighed heavily. So what now, Winston? Are you cutting ties with us, too? The question caught me off guard. I hadn't planned to, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much of my emotional energy had been drained by trying to keep these relationships afloat. I wasn't going to cut them off entirely, but I needed boundaries, firm ones. I'm not cutting ties, I said, keeping my tone steady. But I'm done being the family scapegoat. If you want to keep enabling Kirk, that's your choice. But don't expect me to be part of it. The room went quiet. My mom looked like she was going to protest, but my dad put a hand on her arm, silently telling her to let it go. I stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. I love you both, I said, and I meant it. But I have to put myself first for once. I hope you understand. As I walked out the door, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for what I was leaving behind, but relief for what I was finally letting go of. That evening, I called Miranda. I didn't tell her about the meeting, I just needed to hear a friendly voice. We talked about work, random things in the news, and even joked about how our upcoming product launch would have the competition scrambling. For the first time in what felt like years, I ended the call with a smile. It wasn't just Novatech or the legal victories that were helping me heal. It was realizing that I could build a new support system, one not defined by betrayal and dysfunction. From that day on, I stopped looking back. My focus was forward. A few weeks after cutting ties with Kirk and setting boundaries with my parents, I thought I'd finally turned a corner. Novatech was thriving, and for the first time in years, I felt like my life was my own. But, of course, life had other plans. It started with a knock on my door late one evening. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I checked the peephole. My stomach sank. It was Elsie. For a moment, I debated not answering. But curiosity, and a lingering sense of closure I hadn't fully got the better of me. I opened the door to find her standing there, looking nothing like the confident woman I'd once married. Her eyes were puffy, her hair disheveled, and she was clutching a worn tote bag like it was a lifeline. "Winston," she said softly, her voice breaking. "Can I come in?" I hesitated, but eventually stepped aside. "What do you want, Elsie?" She walked into the living room, glancing around like she didn't recognize the place anymore. I didn't know where else to go. I stayed by the door, arms crossed. "Why are you here?" She sighed and sat down, fidgeting with her bag. "I've made a mess of everything," she admitted. "Kirk, he's not who I thought he was. He's completely shut me out since his arrest. I've lost my friends, my reputation, everything. I don't know how to fix it." I scoffed. "Fix it? Elsie, you burned every bridge you had, and now you want to rebuild? You think coming here is going to change anything?" "I'm not asking for us to get back together," she said quickly, tears streaming down her face. "I know I ruined that. But I need help, Winston. I don't have anyone else." Her words stung. Not because I felt sorry for her, but because of the sheer audacity. After everything she'd done, betraying me, siding with Kirk, trying to sabotage my work, she still thought I'd be her safety net. "I can't help you," I said firmly. "You made your choices, Elsie. You chose Kirk over me, over everything we built. And now you're facing the consequences." Her shoulders slumped, and she buried her face in her hands. "I don't know how to move on," she whispered. I've lost everything. Part of me wanted to feel compassion. But a bigger part of me remembered all the lies, the manipulation, and the sheer pain she'd caused. I wasn't going to let her drag me back into her chaos. You'll figure it out, I said, my tone colder than I intended. But not here. Not with me. She looked up at me, her expression a mix of desperation and defeat. Is there really no chance for us to at least? No, I cut her off. There's no chance. Not now. Not ever. The words hung heavy in the air. Finally, she stood, clutching her bag like it was the only thing keeping her upright. I'm sorry, Winston, she said softly. For everything. I didn't respond as I opened the door for her. She hesitated for a moment, then walked out without looking back. After she left, I sat in the living room for a long time, staring at the empty space where she'd been. I wasn't angry, and I wasn't sad. If anything, I felt a sense of finality. Whatever lingering threads connected me to Elsie were gone now. She was a chapter I'd closed, and I had no intention of reopening it. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Miranda. I didn't call her, but I decided that maybe, just maybe, it was time to start moving forward in a new direction. One that didn't involve looking back. After Elsie's unexpected visit, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, resolve, and surprisingly, hope. Her arrival had brought me clarity, forcing me to confront the last vestiges of the pain she and Kirk had caused. I finally understood that moving forward didn't just mean success with Novatech, it meant allowing myself to rebuild personally as well. Miranda called the next morning. How are you feeling? She asked, her voice laced with concern. I smiled at the thought that she seemed to know something was up. Better than I expected, I replied honestly. Elsie showed up last night. There was a pause on the line. And how did that go? She wanted help, I said simply. I told her no. Miranda exhaled sharply. Good. She doesn't deserve another ounce of your energy, Winston. Her support meant more than I could express. Miranda had become an anchor for me in ways I hadn't anticipated. She didn't just help me navigate the chaos with Kirk and Elsie, she reminded me of who I was outside of all that. And as much as I tried to keep things professional between us, I couldn't deny that there was something more there. Listen, she said after a moment, I was going to wait to bring this up, but how do you feel about taking a break? Just for a weekend. There's a tech conference in San Diego, and I think we could use the trip to clear our heads. It wasn't a hard sell. I hadn't taken a real break in months, and the idea of getting away sounded perfect. When do we leave? I asked, already packing in my head. The conference turned out to be a much-needed reset. The sessions were interesting, and I even got a chance to showcase Novadrive during a breakout panel. But the real highlight was spending time with Miranda outside of the office. On the second night, after a long day of networking and presentations, we found ourselves sitting on a quiet balcony overlooking the city. She handed me a glass of wine, and for a while, we just sat there, enjoying the view. You've come a long way, you know, she said, breaking the silence. A year ago, I don't think you would have believed any of this was possible. I laughed softly. You're not wrong. Some days, it still feels surreal. You've earned it, Winston, she said, her voice firm. You didn't just survive everything Kirk and Elsie threw at you, you thrived. That's not luck. That's you. Her words hit me harder than I expected. For so long I defined myself by the things that had been taken from me, my trust, my marriage, my sense of stability. But hearing her say it like that made me realize how far I'd come. I wasn't just rebuilding. I was becoming someone stronger. Thanks, I said quietly. I don't think I could have done it without you. She smiled, and there was a warmth in her eyes that made my heart skip. I'm glad I could be there, she said, leaning slightly closer. The moment felt charged, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't second-guess it. I leaned in, and when our lips met, it felt like the first truly good thing I'd allowed myself in years. The next morning, as we packed up to head home, Miranda and I didn't talk about what had happened the night before. There was no need to. The connection between us was undeniable, and while neither of us was in a rush to define it, we both knew something had shifted. As we boarded the flight back, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, I could have a future that wasn't defined by betrayal and loss. A future built on trust, resilience, and new beginnings. And this time, I wasn't looking back. Returning from San Diego felt different. Something had shifted, Not just with Miranda, but within me. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely excited about what was ahead. Novatech was thriving, and the tension that had once consumed my life was beginning to ease. But life, as it always does, had a way of reminding me that the past isn't so easily left behind. About a week after we got back, I received an email from my lawyer. Kirk's legal team had reached out, requesting a settlement discussion for the damages he owed me. At first, I considered ignoring it. Kirk's arrest, failed schemes, and public humiliation felt like punishment enough. But then I remembered the patent theft and the months of stress he had caused, and I knew I couldn't just let it slide. The meeting was set for a Thursday afternoon in a neutral conference room downtown. When I arrived, Kirk was already there, looking haggard and worn. His lawyer, a nervous younger man who looked like he was in over his head, sat beside him, shuffling papers. My lawyer, a seasoned professional named Sarah, exuded calm authority as she took her seat next to me. The meeting started with Kirk's lawyer presenting a weak case for leniency, citing Kirk's challenging circumstances and financial troubles. I sat in silence, letting Sarah handle the rebuttals. She was brutal but professional, dismantling their arguments piece by piece until Kirk finally spoke up. "Winston," he said, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it, "I know I messed up. I just want a chance to start over. I can't do that if you take everything." I stared at him for a long moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. He looked defeated, a shadow of the arrogant, conniving brother I had known. But I couldn't forget the choices he'd made, the lies, the betrayal, the sheer audacity of his actions. "I'm not here to ruin your life, Kirk," I said finally, my voice steady. "But you need to face the consequences of what you did. This isn't about me being vindictive. It's about accountability." Kirk nodded, his shoulders slumping further. "I get it," he muttered. I'm sorry, Winston. For everything." I didn't respond. Sorry wasn't enough, not for what he'd done. But I didn't want to carry the weight of anger forever, either. The settlement was agreed upon quickly after that. Kirk would pay a portion of the damages over time and issue a formal retraction of any claims related to Novadrive. It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was enough. More importantly, it was closure. That evening, I told Miranda about the meeting over dinner. She listened intently, her expression thoughtful. "Do you believe him?" she asked after I finished. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to. But I also know Kirk. He's good at saying what people want to hear." She nodded. "You don't have to decide now. Just focus on what you need to move forward." As usual, her advice was spot on. I wasn't ready to forgive Kirk, but I didn't need to carry the anger anymore. I could let it go, not for him but for me. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. I spent my days immersed in Novatech and my evenings reconnecting with parts of myself I'd neglected, reading, running, and slowly exploring what a future with Miranda might look like. It wasn't perfect. The scars from Elsie and Kirk's betrayal were still there, and some days they felt as fresh as ever. But for the first time in years, those scars didn't define me. They were just part of my story, a story that was still being written. And for the first time, I felt like I was the one holding the pen. Just as life seemed to be settling into place, the past found a way to rear its head again. This time, it wasn't Kirk or Elsie, but someone I hadn't thought about in years, my father. My relationship with Dad had always been strained. Growing up, he was distant, more focused on his work and his pride in Kirk than on me. When I launched Novatech and started making waves in the tech world, I expected a call or even a passing acknowledgement from him. Instead, I got silence. It was like he couldn't, or wouldn't, see my success. But that silence broke one afternoon when I got an email from him. It was brief and to the point. "Let's talk. There's something I need to tell you." I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to protect the peace I'd fought so hard to rebuild. But another part of me, the part that still carried a boy's longing for his father's approval, knew I had to hear him out. We met at a quiet cafe near his house. He was already seated when I arrived, looking older than I remembered. His once proud posture was hunched, and his face was lined with more wrinkles than I thought possible. When he saw me, he gave a faint smile. "Winston," he said, standing to shake my hand. "Thank you for coming." I sat across from him, my expression guarded. "You said you had something to tell me." He nodded and took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology. For a lot of things." I blinked, caught off guard. My father was not the kind of man to admit fault, let alone apologize. Okay. I've been a terrible father, he said, his voice heavy with regret. I didn't see you for who you were when you were younger. I was too focused on Kirk, too blinded by my own ideas of what a successful son should look like. And because of that, I ignored your achievements. I made you feel invisible. Hearing those words stung, but they also felt like a release. For years, I'd carried the weight of his dismissal, wondering what I'd done to deserve it. Now here he was, finally admitting the truth. I've been watching you, Winston, he continued. I've seen what you've built with Novatech, how you handled everything with Kirk and Elsie. I'm proud of you. I always should have been. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to yell at him for waiting so long, for only saying these things now when I didn't need his validation anymore. But another part of me, maybe the bigger part, just felt relief. Thank you, I said finally. That means a lot. He nodded, his eyes glassy. I'm trying to make things right, Winston. With you, with your mother, even with Kirk. I don't know if it's too late, but I want to try. I don't know if I can let you back in completely, I admitted. But I appreciate you saying this. It's a start. We talked for a while longer, catching up on things we'd never shared before. It wasn't a perfect conversation, but it felt like a step forward, a small crack in the wall that had always stood between us. That evening, I told Miranda about the meeting. She listened quietly, her hand resting on mine. How do you feel about it? She asked when I finished. I don't know, I said honestly. Part of me feels lighter. Like I've been carrying this resentment for so long, and now I don't have to. But I'm also not sure if I can fully trust him. You don't have to decide that now, she said gently. Healing takes time, Winston. Give yourself the space to figure it out. As always, her words calmed me. I didn't have to figure it all out immediately. For now, I could just let it be. Another piece of my past, confronted but not controlling me. And for the first time, I felt like I was truly beginning to heal, not just from Elsie and Kirk, but from everything.